Hi, we are talking about the 2019 change that the Division of Real Estate has made to the inspection, objection, and termination process. Before we talk about the change, we need to get on the same page about the system that we had before the change, the system that we had for 2018 and prior years. Now, under that system, the buyer, once the buyer had the property under contract, could have the property inspected. And then regardless of whether the buyer had the property inspected, if the buyer discovered something wrong by something called the inspection objection deadline, the buyer had three options. And I'm going to use my hand and my heads to describe those three options. One of those options was the buyer could just keep their mouth shut and suck it up, not bring up the problem that the buyer discovered. The buyer can conclude that the problem with the property is something that was already priced into the property. It didn't discourage the buyer. The buyer loved the property. The buyer didn't want to rock the boat. The buyer could keep their mouth shut. That was one option. Another option was the problem could be so significant that the buyer did not want the seller to fix the problem. The buyer could terminate the contract. A third option, my head is the third option that the buyer had. The buyer had the option of starting this negotiation process, starting this game of chicken by objecting by the inspection objection deadline, asking the seller for some concession like a price reduction or a credit at closing, or the seller to fix the problem prior to closing, or an escrow to fix the problem post-closing, etc., etc. The buyer could have this third option of starting this game of chicken, starting a negotiation process to try and get the seller to fix the problem. If that negotiation was not successful, in the sense that if the parties did not reach a written resolution in this negotiation process by what was called the inspection resolution deadline, then the contract would terminate. Okay, here's the new concept. The new concept is driven by the low inventory market in which the contract was created. And in that low inventory market, there were buyers who wanted to make their offers more attractive by submitting an offer that said, yes, I want to have the property inspected. I need to have the property inspected. But if I detect a problem with the property seller, I am not going to nitpick you. I will only have the option of keeping my mouth shut or terminating. I will not ask you to fix anything. I will not ask you for any concessions. And so if a buyer wants to submit an offer like that, consistent with that theme, the buyer under the new system would submit an offer not with an inspection objection deadline, not with an inspection resolution deadline. And now notice I'm using my hands not to discuss the three options. I am using my hands to identify the deadlines. If the buyer wants to signal that the buyer isn't going to nitpick the seller, the buyer isn't going to ask the seller to fix anything, the buyer submits the offer with merely something called an inspection termination deadline. If the buyer is content with the condition of the property, the buyer keeps their mouth shut and does not exercise their right to terminate. If the buyer is not content, the buyer terminates and the deal is dead. What if you, as a broker, want to create a contract under the 2019 form that is the functional equivalent of the old system, the pre-2019 system? Here's what you do. You submit your offer. The offer would have an inspection objection deadline, the old inspection objection deadline. You would submit the offer that would also have an inspection resolution deadline. So if the inspection objection deadline is 10 days after the formation of the contract, 10 days after mutual execution of the contract, and if inspection resolution is 13 days after the contract, if you wanted to create the functional equivalent of the old system, you would also have an inspection termination deadline on the same day as the inspection objection deadline. That would mean by the inspection objection deadline, the buyer could either ask the seller to make some concessions or terminate the contract. If the buyer did not terminate the contract but asked for some concessions, then the party would have this 3-day window in my example to resolve things. If they didn't resolve things, unless the resolution deadline was extended, the contract would terminate by the resolution deadline if there was not a written agreement in settlement of the buyer's dissatisfaction expressed by the inspection objection deadline. Now, that's how you create the functional equivalent under the old system. It also could make sense. It's buyer-oriented, not seller-oriented, but it could make sense. It's better for the buyer for the inspection termination deadline to be as late as the inspection resolution deadline. It doesn't make any sense for it to be any later. It doesn't make any sense for it to be any later, but it could be late as the inspection termination deadline. I'm sorry, inspection resolution deadline. Where the market will push this, will the market push the inspection termination deadline this way, or will it push the inspection termination deadline to be closer to the inspection objection deadline? That remains to be seen. What mischief do I see with this? One mischief that the Division of Real Estate has anticipated is the concern that people make the inspection termination deadline after the inspection resolution deadline, and they have protected you from that mistake. There is a cool thing in the Real Estate Commission approved contract in section 10.3.2. It happens to be at about row 476 at what I'm looking at, and it prevents you from experiencing that problem. Read that text. But the main mischief that I see is that there just will be misunderstanding about this. In our current market, there are already misunderstandings about how the inspection objection process works. It leads to earnest money skirmishes. Now with the addition of one more date so that we have 3 dates rather than 2, there might be more earnest money skirmishes. And the question is to what benefit? Does this new system, even if a buyer has submitted an offer that calls for merely an inspection termination deadline, that does not call for this chicken game period, does it prevent the buyer from trying to negotiate? No, it doesn't. It doesn't prevent the buyer's agent from getting on the phone, calling the listing broker and saying, look, I know my buyer only has the contractual right to terminate. They don't have the seller to ask, they don't have the ability to ask the seller to fix anything, but my buyer will terminate unless the seller agrees to replace the gutters. Does it prevent that kind of discussion from happening? No, it doesn't. It does not prevent that discussion from happening. It just moves it earlier. It just changes the process a little bit. Time will tell whether this will be a cool thing or not. Time will tell whether this creates mischief or not. I look forward to seeing how that all unfolds. And remember, it's a complex world out there. Be careful.